I hope you've all enjoyed the sunny weekend. How many people have been to the beach this weekend? Like everybody in the world's probably been to the beach this weekend. Lovely. Anybody forget to check the tide times before they went to the beach this weekend? Or were you all wise? Oh, good. Well, I didn't go to the beach this weekend because I did check the tide times and then realised that all of the beaches anywhere nearby don't have sand when the tide is in. Anyway, so I'm sad I haven't been to the beach this weekend. Not relevant to my talk at all. For those of you I haven't met before, my name is Rach. I was with you guys a few weeks ago, but I am normally in the North Site. I'm the North Site pastor. I'm also the youth pastor and a variety of other jobs as well that I won't tell you about. But I'm part of the team here. We are in the middle of a series in Hebrews, if you've just joined us or have missed a few weeks. Hebrews is a book in the New Testament. In the Bible, it is a letter. Just to give you a very quick update, a letter written to Jews about Jesus. And I've always thought that I really like the book of Hebrews. I was very excited that we were preaching through Hebrews. My favourite Bible verse is in Hebrews. And I have read Hebrews like a number of times. This wasn't my first time reading by any means. But the last few weeks when I read over it in depth, I realised it's incredibly complicated and very deep, and definitely written by somebody very well educated. And basically, they spend a lot of the letter explaining who Jesus is. And over the past 5 weeks, we have worked through Hebrews chapter 1 to 10 and looked into who the writer of Hebrews tells us that Jesus is. So if you missed any of those, go back and have a listen on the podcast or on YouTube. It has been a very helpful and theological understanding of Jesus. But this is where we move from the theology into the pastoral bit of Hebrews. Knowing who Jesus is from all of everybody else's talks, we now turn our attention to what it means for our lives. How do we live in response to who Jesus is? If you know the book of Hebrews at all, I imagine that the verse in Hebrews you think of is Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, which is my favourite passage of the Bible, and has been since I was 13, so I'm going to read it to you. Hebrews 12, verses 1 to 3. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Alice is in charge of our preaching schedule for the church, and she asked me a month or so ago if I was around today and would be up for preaching. And I said, I come back from holiday a week before this, like a week ago. So no, unless it's Hebrews 12, 1 to 3. And she was like, it's Hebrews 12, 1 to 3. I was like, okay, then I guess it's a yes. We went to Italy for 2 weeks, and it rained for probably 3/4 of those 2 weeks, which was sad, but I had lots of time to read as a result of not having anything else to do. So my rainy holiday is your gain, because my reading benefited this preach, so you're welcome. The title of this preach, if you're a note maker, is Be Encouraged. This passage was written to the Jews, encouraging them not to grow weary and lose heart. And for them, that was because they were being persecuted. For us, the situation is probably different, but I would bet that there are a fair few of us in this room who feel like we are growing weary and losing heart. Maybe you're not. Maybe you are feeling inspired and faith-filled right now, which is wonderful. This passage describes life with Jesus as running the race marked out for us. So you might feel like you're sprinting, or you might feel like you're just walking, or maybe you're barely crawling. Maybe you're standing on the sidelines deciding whether or not you actually want to join in with the race. Or maybe you feel like you have fully collapsed. But my hope is, this evening, you'll find out that you have collapsed next to the first aid and water station, and you'll find some encouragement to get you back on your feet. So wherever you're at, hopefully this will encourage you on in that race. So we're going to work through the passage in 3 parts. If you know James, our senior pastor, he always tells you how many points he has, and it's never the number of points that he says. So I'm going to say like 3.5 is probably the most accurate number of points I've got. Starting at the beginning, because it's a good place to start. The very first word of this passage is therefore. And I learnt as a teenager that when it says therefore, you ask, what is therefore there for? Now you all know, you can all remember that too. And to answer that, we're going to read Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to quickly skim it. I'm not going to read you the whole 40 verses. But if you've got a Bible, open it up. And we're going to read, I'll tell you every time we're changing verse so you don't get lost. But starting at verse 1 of Hebrews chapter 11, it says, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." Verse 7, "By faith Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family." Verse 8, "By faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going." Verse 11, "And by faith even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she quenched the fury of the flames and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawn in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground." And then jumping to the start of chapter 12. "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses." That's what therefore is there for. We live in a very individualistic society. We don't place much importance on what the generations before us have done, or even what those around us are doing. We focus heavily on ourselves, even in our faith. God has a plan for me. I have to find out who I am and be true to myself. We consider ourselves to be incredibly wise, wiser than the next person, if you're honest. I am the kind of person who thinks I'm always right. I usually am. I'm important. I have great potential. The Lord will do something important and world-changing with me. The problem with placing such a high emphasis on yourself is that when it stops going to plan and you can't see exactly where the Lord is leading you or what he's calling you into, it can feel incredibly hopeless and lonely. If you're solely relying on you and your ability to hear from God, what do you do when you're not sure what he's saying? And when life isn't turning out to be quite what you'd pictured, we can end up feeling lonely and discouraged in our faith, or to quote the passage, we end up growing weary and losing heart. Just before going on holiday, we went to the Vineyard Leaders Gathering, and I had high expectations that the Lord was going to speak. And there were a number of things on my list of things he was going to speak about or give me vision for. And it wasn't that he didn't move. I definitely tangibly encountered the presence of the Lord on a number of occasions, but I didn't come home with any more clarity on what he was saying than I went with. And so I went on my rainy holiday, thinking, well, at least holiday allows plenty of time to have quiet time each day. We have a 2-year-old and she naps in the afternoon, so we take it in turns in that time to have time with the Lord. And so I had high expectations that the Lord was going to speak, which is why I was extra annoyed that it kept raining, because every day I'd have my half an hour quiet time. I found it very difficult to pray anything other than, Jesus, please stop it from raining. We need a holiday, and planning wet weather activities in a caravan for a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old is not a holiday. And also, if you stop it from raining, Jesus, I'll talk to you about something other than the rain. We could talk about some more important things. And halfway through the holiday, I also decided I should take up running again. I took up running last year. I was very proud of myself. And then as soon as the clocks changed, it was dark when I left work, and so I stopped running again. So I thought it was probably about time to take up running again. I thought, I need some encouragement. So while I was running, I decided to listen to Simon Gilbo's podcast, which is called Inspired. Let me tell you, it does what it says on the tin. It was incredibly inspiring. If you want to experience, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, listen to Simon Gilbo's podcast, Inspired. It is just awesome, inspiring stories of people spending their lives following the Lord and all that they have seen him do. Literally, people witnessing to God's goodness, God's guidance in their lives, God's faithfulness in the lowest points of life, God's real power in doing miracles. I'm still processing with the Lord what he's saying to me. But when I took my eyes off me and I allowed the great cloud of witnesses to point my focus to him, I went from feeling hopeless and weary and losing heart to feeling excited and faith-filled and envisioned for what he might do. I have always imagined that the great cloud of witnesses were like people standing on the sidelines cheering while I run a marathon, which, let's be honest, is never going to happen, but while I run a marathon. But they're more than that. They're people who are either running alongside us now or people who have run ahead of us, finished the race, and are now standing on the sidelines cheering us on. And they each have stories to tell of how to run the race well. That's a hard sentence. Run the race well. And the awesome things they've seen God do while they have run the race. There is so much encouragement to be gained from those who have gone before or are running alongside us. And taking time to seek that out will only spur you on. So how do you do that? There are podcasts. Genuinely go and listen to Simon Gilbo's podcast. It's amazing. Or there's books of people's amazing testimonies. I can remember reading a lot of years ago now, There Is Always Enough by Heidi Baker, but it was so inspiring. And there's loads of other ones. Just like talk to your small group, talk to Christian friends, ask them what they would recommend. We also have a set of sermon series called By Faith, which look at the lives of people throughout the Bible and all that we can learn from them, literally based on this passage. So go back in our podcast and have a listen to them. You can't live off someone else's faith, but you can borrow it when yours is struggling, and sometimes that kickstarts yours again. So listening to inspiring podcasts and reading amazing books is a great place to start, but there is more to being surrounded by the great cloud of witnesses than that. Jumping back in Hebrews a tiny bit to Hebrews chapter 10, verses 24 and 25, it says this. And let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. There is a reason that we meet together weekly as a church, and we're not still watching church on YouTube like we were in lockdown. There is a reason we place such a high value on small groups. We're meant to meet together to encourage one another on in our faith, to spur one another on. If you have Christian community, for example, your small group, when you're journeying a difficult season, there are people surrounding you who can testify to the goodness of God. When you're wondering whether to step out in something you feel like God is calling you into, there are people around you who can testify from their own experience that God is faithful and he always provides. When you've made bad choices and you feel far from God, there are people around you who can testify to his grace and his forgiveness and how he redeems our failures. And you also get to be that for others. You get to share your story of what God has done in your life and spur others on around you. To not grow weary and lose heart, it is essential that we are surrounded by the great cloud of witnesses. So, carrying on, because that's only the first half of a verse. It says, therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. We can so easily get entangled with sin, which in a weird way makes me feel encouraged because we're not the exception if we get entangled with sin. The writer of Hebrews is acknowledging that it is so easy to end up entangled in sin, to realize that you have developed thought patterns or behaviors that are not godly. And it doesn't excuse it or make it okay, but it removes the shame. So if you're sitting here today thinking, I know there's an area of sin in my life that I need to deal with, don't sit here feeling ashamed and assuming that everyone around you has got it all together. It is so easy to get entangled with sin, but the passage tells us in no uncertain terms that we need to throw it off. We have to throw off the sin that so easily entangles. So how do we do that? How do we be on our guard against getting entangled with sin? I finished a Christian book on holiday, which I think deserves a medal. I'm very good at starting Christian books. I'm not very good at finishing Christian books. But I did finish one. Like I said, my rainy holiday was your gain. And it was Live No Lies by John Mark Comer. And I'm basically going to borrow a whole section of his, well, most of his book for a section of my preach, because it was very wise and very helpful and very relevant to this preach. So The whole thesis of his book is basically presenting this theory on why we end up living in patterns of sin. Why does sin so easily entangle us? Which I'm going to try and summarize, because if we know what we're up against, it's much easier to defend against it. His theory starts with the fact that the devil lies to us. Jesus, when he's talking about the devil in John chapter 8, verse 44, says, "When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies." So we know that to be biblically true. And you will have experienced this plenty, even if you haven't identified it as the devil's lies. We don't talk about that a lot. But they're thoughts that creep into our lives that aren't God, like, I'm not good enough. Maybe it doesn't matter if I live outside of what the Bible says. Is God really good? Did God really say that? If I tell my friends I'm a Christian, they'll think I'm weird. Nobody cares about me. God could never love me. I've done too much wrong. It's stupid to rely on God. The cost of following Jesus is too great on my kids. It was fine before we had kids to go wherever he led, but good parenting is to provide them with security. Let me be clear, everything I have just said is a lie. Any thoughts that are not in line with biblical truth are by nature lies. But lies on their own are just lies. They have no power. The problem is the devil's lies play into our disordered desires. Let me explain what I mean by that. We all have lots of desires. We have some desires that are good, godly desires, and we have some that are not good. The Bible often calls them of the flesh. I won't keep saying that because it's a weird phrase, but so for example, I would like to look after my body and be healthy and fit and physically ready to look after my kids, to serve the Lord. I'd also really, really like to eat a large bar of Cadbury's Dairy Milk every day with a cup of tea once my kids have gone to bed instead of going out for a run. We talk a lot in our culture about being true to ourselves, following our hearts. But how do I be true to myself and follow my heart when my heart wants two mutually exclusive things? I want to buy my clothes in a way that is fair and ethical, where everyone in the process gets paid a fair amount of money. I also want to buy them cheaply. I want to parent my kids well and give them my full attention, but I also want to hide with my phone in the stressful hour between getting home from work and nursery and having to do bath time. You will have your own mutually exclusive desires, but we can't be true to all of our desires because lots of them are mutually exclusive. We talk a lot about freedom as a culture, but biblical freedom isn't what the world thinks freedom is. The world thinks that freedom is freedom to do whatever we want. But that is not biblical freedom. Biblical freedom is the freedom from being ruled by our non-godly desires and the freedom to choose to go after our godly desires even when we don't feel like it. So Comer's principle is that the devil lies and his lies feed into the desires that we have that are not of God. So our challenge is to reject the lies and choose the desires that are of God. What makes that extra challenging is we live in a world that normalizes sin. And so we don't feel like it's that big of a deal when we go after our non-godly desires. And so when his lies hit on our non-godly desires and those desires coincide with things that the world tells us are not that big of a deal, we're much more likely to go along with them, to choose our non-godly desires over our godly desires, and that is when we end up entangled in sin. So what do we do? How do we throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles? Firstly, and very briefly, I just want to go back to the first point of my talk. We are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. The world normalizing sin is another reason that it is so important to surround ourselves with a great cloud of witnesses. We do faith in community. Our primary culture doesn't have to be the culture of the world which normalizes sin. Our primary culture can be a community who loves God and wants to live in line with what he has for our lives. We can choose to get stuck into a small group community where people will normalize living for God rather than living without God, which will help us on our way to choosing our godly desires over our non-godly desires. And secondly, we need to know the truth. The Bible is truth. And Jesus himself said, the truth will set us free. In his book, Comer suggested the best way to combat the lies of the enemy is to know scriptural truth in the face of each lie. And I have experienced this. I have we have 2 children, like I said. Both of them were born by cesarean section. And I reasoned, it was planned, so I reasoned before I went in that there were probably going to be times in surgery that I would feel scared. And so I learned off by heart Psalm 56, verse 3, which says, "When I am afraid, I put my trust in you." And as I sat in the theatre, you sit on the edge of the bed and they put a spinal in your back. Sorry if you're squeamish. It's quite scary. And I just repeated in my head over and over again, "When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you." And it brought me peace. I go through seasons of having nightmares. And during those seasons, I don't really like going to bed because I'm anticipating it's not going to be very fun. But I have learnt the verse, "In peace I will lie down and sleep. For you alone, Lord, make me dwell in safety." And so I repeat that over and over in my head as I go to sleep. Write down the lies and the unhelpful thoughts that regularly come into your mind and ask God what the scriptural truth is in response to those lies. Not so you can argue with the devil, but so you can change the channel from lies to truth. And look at what you let into your mind. How much of what you look at on your phone, watch on TV, read, listen to, talk about is truth, and how much of it is lies? We are really careful with kids what we let them get into their brain. Judah is our eldest, he's 4, and he's just getting to the stage where he's interested in watching films, which I'm excited about. And so we've been talking about what films he might like to watch, and one of the films we suggested was Monsters, Inc. And then I thought, do I really want to put in your head the idea that there might be a monster hiding under your bed? Maybe I'm being an overprotective parent, but you see my point. There are some things that are just not helpful to have in our brains. They're lies, and they're not doing us any good. The Bible tells us, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. What are you letting into your heart and mind? Everything you do flows from what's in there. You're making your life really difficult if you're trying to throw off sin, but everything you're watching and listening to and reading on your phone is normalizing sin. We need to be taking in truth, not lies. Let me read that verse again. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. We're trying to throw off sin here, and this verse says everything we do flows from what we allow into our heart. Is it possible that you're setting yourself up to fail by the things that you're letting into your heart and mind? So we're called to throw off everything that hinders. And lastly, we're called to fix our eyes on Jesus. Going back to the verse, let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus. And this is the title of the whole Hebrews series. It is essential, if we want to run the race marked out for us, that we put in habits and disciplines and practices that teach us to fix our eyes on Jesus. You can't run a race if you're looking at the floor or over your shoulder or at your phone. I can remember as a teenager walking into a lamppost because I was looking at my phone. It was embarrassing. You have to look where you're going. Especially if you want to run towards Jesus, you need to fix your eyes on Jesus. It won't happen by accident. Pretty much nothing in the world around us will accidentally direct our attention to Jesus. If you are feeling discouraged, if you're growing weary and losing heart, ask yourself, am I fixing my eyes on Jesus? If you don't already, put in daily time where you spend time with Jesus. One of the best practices I've ever put into my daily prayer time is doing Live From Rest meditations. It's a free app. And it's, in their words, meditation rooted in the way of Jesus. And it's so incredibly helpful because in the seasons that I have regularly done it, I can basically train my brain to be able to switch off all the other channels, all the distractions, all the worries and the random thoughts and fix my eyes on Jesus. So give that a go. It's called Live From Rest. It's free to download. It's worth a try. There's also loads of other stuff you can do in your daily quiet time with God. Follow a Bible reading plan. Journal your prayers. Get a daily devotional. If you're not sure of what to do, ask your small group what they do and just try a bunch of stuff until you find something that works for you. So getting regular prayer time is a really important place to start, but it's not the end of the line. Spending 25 minutes in the morning with God isn't necessarily going to keep your eyes fixed on him all day. Are there other areas of your life where you need to redress the balance of things that cause you to fix your eyes on Jesus and things that distract you from Jesus? Maybe it's something little like choosing to listen to worship instead of the radio in the car, so when you arrive at work, you're feeling at peace rather than already stressed about the state of the world. Maybe it's some of the stuff you watch on Netflix. Are they helpful things to fix your eyes on? My very last point 3.5, is that we don't just fix our eyes on Jesus to make it to the end without tripping over. We fix our eyes on Jesus because that in itself is encouragement. Reading the last bit of the passage, it says, "For the joy that was set before him," this is talking about Jesus, "he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." He ran this race ahead of us. He took up punishment for our sins, and he sat down at the right hand of God to cheer us on and intercede for us. He has run this race before us, and he didn't get the easy track. He ran through persecution and ultimately a brutal death to go ahead of us, to welcome us into the kingdom. He ran this race to make sure that the path we're following leads to eternal life in the kingdom of God. He has made it so every single one of us can run to the end of the race and cross the finish line as long as we keep our eyes fixed on him. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, who knows what it is to live in this world, with the pressures and the temptations, with betrayal and persecution, with needs and hopes and pain, who has laid this race out for you. Consider him that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Be encouraged. Be encouraged by the great cloud of witnesses surrounding you, and be encouraged by Jesus. We can throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and we can run this race to the end because Jesus has done it ahead of us. Surround yourself with the great cloud of witnesses and fix your eyes on Jesus, and where you feel weary, where you're losing heart, you will find encouragement to keep on running.